writer. I know dialogue.
That's a fountain of conversation, man. That's a geyser.
Interesting.
Interesting.
Yes, provocative.
Oh, Daddy, stand back, man. Woo! Rock and roll!
Welcome to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Online at bookedonrock.com, where you can find every episode along with links to listening platforms, exclusive videos, blogs, and the latest rock book releases. It's another chapter in the dialogue series, a chill and chat with authors, fellow podcasters, listeners, and more. Brian Colburn, he is the host of one of my favorite podcasts, My Weekly Mixtape. Brian invites fellow music fans along with the artists themselves to collaborate with him in an attempt to curate the ultimate playlist based on a different artist, band, or topic each week. I just recently recorded an episode with Brian to put together the ultimate Van Halen mixtape. Had a blast with that, looking forward to hearing that episode when it goes up. But today, Brian is on the Booked on Rock podcast to talk about his favorite bands and artists, the books on rock he's read, wants to read, and would love to see written. We talk about Tom Petty, Dave Grohl, Metallica's James Hetfield, Trey Anastasio of Phish, and much, much more. I also test Brian's knowledge of tape cassette history, do some cassette trivia. So let's get into it now. Here is Brian Colburn. Brian Colburn, welcome to the Booked on Rock podcast. How you doing, man?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me, man.
Just spoke with you recently for an episode of your podcast on the mighty Van Halen. So now I wanted to return the favor. Here you are.
Well, I'm excited to do it, and thank you so much for coming on. That was a ridiculously fun episode. I mean, that was the first time on My Weekly Mixtape I had two guests on simultaneously, and I was curious if we'd be able to keep up with the conversation and make something that made sense. And I was kind of blown away with the three of us put together there.
The podcast, what's cool about it is it doesn't necessarily have to be all the hits. It's what you think is your ultimate mixtape. So there's really no right or wrong. But having said that, I was still like, how did I leave that one out?
It's the post-show guilt that happens all the time.
That's right. So tell us about yourself. Where are you from and what got you into rock music before we talk about the podcast?
What got me into rock music? I didn't know we had 5 hours for tonight. Let's get this thing started. No, rock music was solely because of my parents. On Friday night when I was growing up, my father would get home from work and he'd be like, we're not turning the TV on tonight. And he would break out the stereo and pull out the records and we would start playing music together. And I just got so used to music becoming the kind of event for the night in my childhood. They would put on their music. They would let me put on, at the time, my children's records, which was stuff from the Muppets, the Chipmunks. So I would put like my Chipmunk Punk on, and they had songs by the Cars and Tom Petty and all these different groups done by the Chipmunks. And then my father would go, well, yeah, you like this song over here called Refugee? So he'd pull out Damn the Torpedoes and put that on and be like, let's listen to the real version. And he kind of took that and spun it into me listening to bands like AC/DC, Black Sabbath, The Doors, Huey Lewis and the News, Pat Benatar, Fleetwood Mac. And that's what got me into rock music. And I started in radio in the mid-90s. I was at a college radio station, Montclair State University, WMSC at the time, 90.3. And I was a junior in college. I really wanted to get on the air. And they said, well, unfortunately, we don't have many slots to fill. However, there are some genres that no one wants to do. So if you're willing to hop on one of these genres, you might get your foot in the door quickly. So that following Monday morning at 6 a.m., I started my weekly country radio show in New Jersey. And I took that and fell in love with country music because I would reach out to all my friends in North Carolina and they would spoon feed me what albums to go pick up. And then I would just spin them on the air, work with the different labels to try to get country music in. So I kind of became the country music director there for the years I was there. And then I turned that into a career in radio that included Westwood One Radio Networks and the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah.
And from there, I pivoted full-time for my full-time work into business podcasting, which is what I currently do now. And then a joke I actually had with my boss this week, when I'm done podcasting and doing videos and content for my work for 40 hours a week, I don't go anywhere, and I turn the mic on and I start podcasting for fun. So
Oh, that's great. See, I didn't know what you did during the day, so you're doing this stuff all day. Well, you could tell because the podcast is produced professionally and it just sounds great. And talk
Thank
about
you.
the concept, the what led you to the idea and the concept of the podcast, My Weekly Mixtape.
the concept was built around basically kind of an autobiographical show about me growing up. When I was growing up, if I was a good boy and did all my chores for my folks, when we went food shopping, my mom would let me grab a 2-pack of cassettes. And depending on the level of chores that I did, I was either able to get the clear, cheaper 90-minute TDKs, or if I was extra, if I really made sure my room was in tip-top shape, I get those Maxell XL2s.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the good stuff where you run your CDs and vinyl all onto cassette. And I was obsessed every weekend with taking my cassettes and songs off the radio and kind of like a mad scientist, putting these songs together in an order that I enjoyed. And as I started making friends in grammar school and in elementary school and middle school, we would get together and bring our cassettes and we would sit there and dub songs back and forth and create these mixtapes, me and a friend of mine, kind of the songs that I liked and songs that he liked. So that way we could kind of have a mix that we would both dig listening to. And the idea of this show was born in that. I bring on different guests, musicians, friends, and we build those old mixtapes with the songs in mind versus just grabbing a bunch of songs on Spotify, dragging them into a playlist and hitting shuffle.
What was the very first mixtape you ever created? And do you remember what was on it?
I could tell you what the content was. I was actually joking with my wife. The name of it was something, I was probably 6 or 7. I think I called it the Get Up, Get Down Rock Party or something like that. And all it was songs recorded off of Z100 in New York. So I had a lot of the top 40 songs that were popular, but I also was at the time obsessed with the Z Morning Zoo. So they would do song parodies in the morning. And if I was lucky, I would capture the parodies of the songs that were popular on the radio at the time. So I kind of made this mix of the popular songs and then the parodies and then some radio skits and then other top 40 stuff as well.
So that's not so easy to do because you actually have to be there by the radio waiting when to hit record.
Yes, and there were times that I would get a copy of a song. Oh yeah. I mean, there was points when you would record a song on the radio. If the song was brand new, I knew you were not getting it without a DJ talk up because they always had to play the new song and talk over the top. And they would always talk over the popular songs. However, 2, 3, 4 weeks into that song cycle, the song would move to the middle of the block. So I would always make sure, so I had a copy of the song, record it with the DJ talk up, but I would get sneaky at points where I would re-record over the song and try to get without the talk up for future. So I would always leave like 4 or 5 seconds in between songs in case I screwed up. I wouldn't cut off the next song.
Wow. See, you had the mind for that shit right away. You were on it right away.
I was trying to go boss level as a kid.
I used to love to do that kind of stuff. Like my older brother had a vinyl record player. And I remember one of the first things I put on tape was Springsteen's Live 75 to 85 that my my brother-in-law lent to me. And I gave it back to him right away, like 10 years later. And I used to love there was a way that you could fade down because they were all live tracks. And I was so excited to do that. Like I was in the studio, all those little things. So you had that mind, you had that production mentality that, that you have to get it just right.
Yeah. I was one of those kids that sat there staring at the radio like this, just dreaming of being in radio one day. Oh, yeah. And then I made that dream come true. And then when I was doing it, I'm like, man, this isn't all like, this isn't what I pictured as a kid. It's a completely different industry, but I fell in love with it and have taken production into things outside of radio, but I always have that radio mindset.
How many mixtapes would you say you've made total in your lifetime?
Hundreds. easily. And I could say hundreds without a doubt, because every year when we would go on vacation, I had a 30-pack zipper case that you'd put cassettes in. Now I'm going to give away my age a little bit here, but you had 3 rows of 10. In the far right row, I had my Game Boy, and I had room for 6 games and the Game Boy.
Yes.
In the middle slot, I had room for the Walkman and the fold-up headphones. And on the right slot, I had 10 slots. And I wasn't going to bring full albums because those were only 40 minutes. I needed for a 10-hour car ride. So I spent like 3 months leading up to a vacation making at least 10 90-minute mixtapes to bring for that car ride. And then in the front pouch, I always made sure to buy extra batteries because you had the Game Boy, you had the Game Boy Light, and the Walkman. I was going through AA batteries like it was no one's business.
I love that you were a pro. Now, have you ever had that situation where, by the way, Case Logic, that was the one I had, the Case Logic.
Yes.
It would zip up and it would be 2-sided so you could fit even more cassettes, right? But have you ever left the flap open like on a hot summer day and it melted the tapes? Yeah, I've had that.
Yeah. I've done that. And then when you want to fast forward 10 years later, that CD book that Case Logic made that had the plastic, if you left that in the sun for just a little bit too long, the plastic would melt to the top of the CD. And when you'd go to pull it out, you'd rip all the information off. I can't tell you. At that point, I think it was like the 5th or 6th time that I ruined one of my favorite albums.
Yeah.
When they weren't. CDs were, this was mid 90s. This was peak CDs. You weren't getting them for $1 each at their used CD store. These were $15 investments. Anytime, once I had a few of them destroyed, I then pivoted to, I'm only bringing burned CDs in the car because I'm sick of ruining all of them.
Exactly. What do you miss most about cassettes? What do you miss the least about cassettes?
The least is sound quality. I mean, I don't want to go technical here, but you got a really tiny tape that you're splitting in half and then siding A and B with the channel. It's not meant for the fantastic fidelity. Even the Maxell XL2s, which were the standard, those were definitely a resolution loss. And if you were taking someone else's cassette and dubbing it, you were going down a generation. Whereas with digital, when you made a copy, it's an exact copy. And a burned CD and a regular CD sound exactly the same. The zeros and ones all level out. So to me, that was the downside of cassettes. But the upside of cassettes was, believe it or not, the art in them, the time. Because when I sat and made a cassette for, let's say, a girl I was interested in, and I sat there for several hours putting together all these songs that I think she would enjoy, that kind of show off my musical tastes, as you will. And that was time. When you gave someone you fancied a mixtape, you are saying, I spent all this time making this for you. Whereas if you just make a playlist, you could say, I spent the last 11 seconds dragging these songs on here. To me, that's what I loved about cassettes and still do, which is why I use the play on it in the show name, because when you drag songs randomly onto a playlist and hit shuffle, sure, you can enjoy the music. But when you made a mixtape and you spent 3 hours putting those songs in a specific order that really fit what you were looking for, you invested that time and energy. And that made it feel that much more special when you went to play it.
Interesting. Yeah, and that's similar to just the connection we made with radio as opposed to just streaming services without the personality. There's a personality aspect of cassettes, mixtapes specifically. What was your go-to cassette company? You did touch on this a little bit earlier when it came to getting the best sound quality, like the best bang for your buck. These are the big names back in the day: Fuji, Maxell, Memorex, Philips, Scotch, Sony, TDK. I covered them all. Those are all the biggies, right?
Yeah. Now, the Memorex, the ones that were rainbow colored, you know the one I'm talking about? They had like the little bit of red, the blue. Those were my go-to radio cassettes because the colors signified to me this was recorded off the radio. So no matter what I wrote on the top, I always knew it was good enough for radio recordings.
Okay.
The Maxell XL2 90 minutes, those were meant for CDs and vinyl, and a dub coming from an official recording of a cassette. So a one generation loss. The TDKs were if someone had a copy of a cassette and I wanted a copy of that copy, but I didn't want to waste the really expensive Maxells. I would use the TDKs for that. So I had a look, or a band practice. If I took a little cassette player and put it in the center of the room, you could use the cheaper cassettes because you weren't getting much fidelity anyway there.
Okay, so there was certain cassettes for certain situations. There wasn't.
Yeah, people are listening, going, "God, this guy's a nerd." But
I love it. and we're using, by the way, the terminology. I guess we should explain. Lose a generation, because that's an interesting one. That's like an inside term, radio term too.
Yeah, I didn't think about that.
It's when you dub a cassette onto another cassette, it loses sound quality. And it's like a generation, like one generation. If you then dub that dubbed cassette onto another, that's two generations. It just gets worse and worse and worse. It gets more muddy. It's got a hiss to it. I don't know. Is that the best way to explain it?
Yeah, because you're taking all this musical information and you're taking it from a vinyl, which has a lot of the grooves that it's definitely much more sonically appealing, which is why they say albums sound more warm. But when you put a cassette, you can't bring vinyl records into your car. Although I digress, because my father did have a 45 player in one of his cars. He said it was the biggest waste of time. You put the needle down, you'd step on the gas, the needle would go flying. Wow. So you could only listen to records when you were parked.
They were supposed to have some kind of a balance to it, I think.
That never, he said didn't happen.
Like no matter, even if you hit a speed bump, but no, that wasn't going to happen.
I mean, you remember in the 90s when we had those CD Discmen that we would bring in the car with us and use the cassette adapter. I used to have a bed pillow on the car seat next to me that I would put the Discman on, almost like this fluffy cloud, to try to get it to, as soon as I stepped on the gas, that CD thing was going straight across the floor and skipping. God. Yeah.
Wow. You've had some great episodes. Amazing guests. Blues Traveler and Spin Doctors are two of my favorite bands, and you have had a couple guys on the show that are connected to those bands. Spin Doctors drummer Aaron Comes on. That was recently. I love that one. And I see you have Tad Kinchla, bassist of Blues Traveler, coming up soon, right?
Yes, that'll be airing in the next 2 weeks with the release of their new album, Traveler's Soul. And we talked for a good hour about all things. Blues Traveler is one of my favorite. I love the New York music scene from the 90s. I also have an episode with John O'Manson, who did a duo album with John Popper called Bootlegger Days that just got released. So there's things about the New York music scene that I've always loved. And that sound that came out, that lightning in a bottle, Spin Doctors, Blues Traveler sound, I've always gravitated to. And I'm such a huge fan of all their discographies. It was an absolute honor to have both Aaron and Tad on, because I know these guys, kind of, not Tad essentially, because he joined after Bobby passed for Blues Traveler, but all of these guys knew each other. They came up together. A lot of the guys are from Princeton. When you talk about, the guys from Blues Traveler, John Popper, Chan and Tad Kinchla, Bobby Sheehan, all from Princeton. Then you add in Chris Barron. These guys all kind of grew up together, and they have this connection and friendship and music that I find absolutely fascinating. And on top of it, their music kicks ass. So,
yeah, and the guests, they provide some great insight, because when you had Aaron Comes on, he talked about something I'd thought about for so long. When they had that first album, Pocketful of Kryptonite, it blew up huge. They have the second album. The lead single on your second album, that's a huge decision, because that's make or break. It's got to be a big one. And they went with Cleopatra's Cat, and I remember that.
Yeah.
And it's a great song, but not a single. Everybody was surprised. I was interning at a radio station in New Haven, rock station, and everybody's just kind of scratching their heads like, okay. And he mentioned that. He's like, the guy, we all discuss this, and in retrospect, we probably should have done You've Let Your Heart Go Too Fast as the first single, because it sounded more like what was on the previous album, and then worked our way into something like Cleopatra's Cat. And I was like, he's talking about it, because I thought about that for years. Like, what did those guys think about that? Did they regret that decision? Did they have second thoughts over that?
When I first bought that album, the first thing I thought when I heard Big Fat Funky Booty for the first time, I'm like, how is this not the lead single?
Yeah.
Because that to me explains where that album goes. Cleopatra's Cat is a definite left turn on the album, and on the album Listen, which people have given up, but on the album Listen, Cleopatra's Cat makes a lot of sense.
Turn It Upside Down, by the way, right? That's the second album.
Yeah. Yeah. Plucking that out as the lead single doesn't really give you a representation of what that album's all about.
And immediately I think people thought Sophomore Slump, these guys are just one and done. Hit album, that's it. Which that album's very good. I really like that album, but if they maybe made a different decision in retrospect. And then it's interesting because as the spin started to decline, you get Blues Traveler all of a sudden, like a year or two later, when Runaround was released in 95 or late 94 maybe, and they had their run. So they had their time in the sun.
John Popper was already making big waves musically. You think about What Would You Say from Dave Matthews Band. He was already out there.
Right.
People knew that he was a one-of-a-kind harmonica player. And I think it just took until the 4 album for the band to catch fire on the radio. Because in the live music scene, they were already massive.
And that first album was great. And the second album, the first album was the self-titled. The second one was Travelers and Thieves.
Yes.
Which is great as well, but they just didn't have that huge single.
And all it took was that huge single to make people go backwards, because after 4 came out, about a year and a half later, the movie Kingpin comes out, which we talked about on, I talked about that with Jono, because his track Miss Fabulous is on that soundtrack along with But Anyway. They didn't have to ask Blues Traveler to put out a brand new song for that soundtrack because people discovered them at 4. They had 3 albums worth of material, and But Anyway exploded on that movie. And then people started going back and buying the self-titled album because of Kingpin. And I think that's amazing.
I love But Anyway. It's just still sounds great as if it just came out today. But Anyway, classic. Now here's a little inside baseball, but I'm just curious if you asked Aaron Comas, or maybe you weren't allowed to, because after listening to your episode, I realized that their bassist, Mark White, had a falling out with him. He's not in the band. Were you told you can't talk about it?
No, I just on my show choose not to go down that road and keep it all about the music. If it comes up naturally in conversation, which it has on several episodes of my show, I had Frank Hannon of Tesla that I recently recorded with, and they talked about how some of the members are no longer with the band and kind of how that falling out happened. But we were doing that in reference to where the band was at and the drugs that were flowing through the band at the time of Tesla's breakup. So if it comes up naturally in conversation, I'm okay with it. But I try to keep my show focused on the songs and music, because the reasoning behind the split I read had a lot to do with stuff being posted online and politics. Right. And politics. I don't want to go down that road. I'm more of a guy that just wants to celebrate the songs. And he said, she said, with why somebody's in the band, I'm not really.
It's not that type of show.
I've had guests on, and I won't say names, and I won't go into too many details to spoil this, where I brought up a question about a specific project, and this artist just went, I refuse to talk about that project. And apparently there was a lot of drama surrounding said project that had nothing to do with the music. And I even followed up saying, look, I'm talking solely about the guitar riff and the song. I refuse to talk about. And to me, that was very eye-opening, because regardless of the falling out between different entities, they still created this amazing piece of art. And that's what I was talking about, not the things outside of it, the TMZ stuff, if you will. That's not what's important to me. It's kind of getting to the heart of these amazing songs that we all care about in some way, shape, or form.
You had Huey Lewis and the News drummer Bill Gibson on.
Oh, that was
that was I love Huey Lewis and the News, and he was a great guest. And there was one moment too where you're like, well, that's news to me. Like, he didn't realize it was something like
Some
compilation or
re-releases.
box set or whatever. He goes,
Yeah,
oh,
yeah.
oh, okay. That's good to know. Nobody told me.
And that's where my nerddom comes in. My goal when I conduct an interview for the show or have a guest on, I actually do a ridiculous, probably more than I should, but a ridiculous amount because my radio background, I listen to every interview that artist has done in the last 2 to 3 months. And if there's a question that's asked more than twice, I feel like, he's already talked about those things. Let's put that off. Unless they're questions that they really want to speak on. And I will try to find different ways to ask if it's a new album that they're promoting. I'll find different ways to hone in on the album as opposed to the why is this the best album you've ever recorded question, because I feel like that's kind of the same old, and I want to think outside the box and I want to get a little bit more nerdy with the music. And my hope is that these people leave remembering the show for the fact that, wow, these were not the typical what tour dates you have coming up this year questions. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with those. Let me be very honest. I want to get that news, but sometimes I just want to find out a little bit more about why this bass line changes up in the middle of the song to change where the song is headed, because I've never heard it asked before, but I've always wondered about it.
That stuff's fascinating to me too. That's the minutia, the nuts and bolts of the song. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Art Alexakis from Everclear, another one of my favorite bands. He was on, and I guess we both had Billy Joel drummer Liberty DeVito. What an interview. Oh. What a great guy. When you have the artists themselves on, are there surprises? Like, do they tend to pick more of like the obscure songs rather than the hits? Do they have a different approach? Do you notice any kind of similarities whenever you have the guy who was on the music, who was part of the recording?
I think in those situations, it really boils down to striking a balance between the songs that people expect to hear and the songs that maybe not everybody knows, album cuts, B-sides, however, that really means something to those artists, because not every one of their babies becomes a hit song. And some of these songs mean so much to them. This gives them an avenue to talk about those songs. So for Liberty DeVito, for example, I don't want to give away spoilers about the show. I hate to do that, but I'll just give one bombshell that maybe will entice people to listen to the episode. Piano Man doesn't make the top 20. And
wow.
It's not for a hatred of the song on my part specifically. And for Liberty's, I'll just say that, let's just say Billy and the band might not be massive fans of that song, even though they know its importance and respect its importance.
Well, and he's not on that track either, Liberty, right? Because
no,
he joined the
not.
band on the third album, but still,
but having played it every night from Turnstiles all the way through when he left the band, that's decades of playing Piano Man every single night. You still grow a connection to that song.
So before we get into some rock books talk, I want to test your cassette history knowledge, okay? And I didn't send you these questions ahead of time. So I came up with
this is a way to discredit the whole show.
Yeah, came up with 5 questions, multiple choice. You ready?
Oh, boy.
Here we go. What year was the cassette invented? A, 1962, B, 1974, or C, 1980?
See, my brain is like, I want to say 62, but I don't think they were commercially available till much later, because I'm trying to think of reel-to-reel tapes. Then they had the 8 tracks. Oh God, I'm gonna go with. I might be wrong, but I'm gonna go with the earliest.
You got it right.
All right, okay.
1962. Let me go down to, I did also, this is from a website. I can't recall what the website is. Fun facts about cassette decks and cassette tapes. But in 1962, Philips invented the compact cassette medium for audio storage, specifically for audio storage. All right, 1 for 1. What is the shelf life of a cassette? A, 10 years, B, 20 years, C, 30 years.
I'm going to have to base that one off of fact of personal knowledge. It might not be what they're supposed to be, but I still have cassettes that I am actually in the middle of digitizing because I have a fun little project that I'm doing where I'm taking all the mixtapes I used to make and I'm going to digitize them and then kind of do some social posts about what did I put on tape in 1987.
Cool.
That's over 25 years. So I will say 20 is the answer, but I have tapes that are well over 30 years old and they still work for me, but I'm going to assume the shelf life would be less than that because of whatever factors they may be. So I'm going to guess 20.
Man, you were leaning towards the right answer. 30.
It was 30. Okay.
Correct answer. Yeah.
All right. See, I was trying to go a little, I mean, look, some of them didn't last 30 minutes in my car when I put them right on the dashboard. So I was trying to like find a happy medium with that answer.
All right, here we go. So we got 1 out of 2. Okay. Question number 3. Cassette tapes come in lengths ranging from A, 50 to 120 minutes, B, 60 to 120 minutes, or C, 30 to 120 minutes.
C.
C, you say 30 to 120 minutes. The answer is B, 60 to 120 minutes.
I've recorded on 30-minute cassettes before though.
Okay, so we need to check. We need to do a
I have
check.
when I was in the studio with my band in, I want to say it was 1995, my high school band recorded at a studio and we had a cassette in the studio and we recorded 15-minute sides and we had like 3 songs aside because we had to, and that's the way we listened to the demo. They were only in the studio. We had to go to Sam Ash to get them, but they were 30-minute cassettes.
Yes, sir. The referee is saying we're gonna give it to him. I Googled quickly. There are 30-minute audio cassettes. Now, how did this website?
Now, commercially, like when you went to the stores, like record stores, I only remember seeing 60, 90, and 120. But if you went to Sam Ash at the time, where it was meant for studio recordings, there were 30 minutes there.
Wow. Okay, we're gonna give it to you then. We're giving it to you. All right. So that two out of 3. All right. Is there a meatloaf joke coming? 2 out of 3. All right. Question number 4. What year was the first Sony Walkman released? A, 1977, B, 1979, or C, 1981?
Gonna go with 79 as a guess.
You are correct.
Nice.
3 out of 4. All right, the 5th one is the hardest of them all. So if you get this one, I would be impressed. The tape inside of a cassette is how wide? A, 1/8 of an inch, B, 1/10 of an inch, C, 1/12 of an inch.
1/8.
God damn it, you got it right. Did you know that?
Yes, because when I was in college, we actually were still working on tape. And it wasn't until after I graduated that we went digital. And when I was talking earlier, I didn't want to get too nerdy with you, but when I talked about losing generations, you have 1/8 of a side of tape, which is side A and side B, which gives you 1/16 of a side of tape for a side A and side B. And then when you split that stereo, it's actually 1/32 of a side of tape for the left channel and the right channel on a cassette tape, which is why the sound quality is a little less. I'm a big nerd.
and you were leaning towards the right answer on that. You were leaning towards 30 years on that second one. You could have.
We should give me that though, because I said I had tapes older than 30.
I mean, that is impressive. The Booked on Rock podcast will be back after this. Brian Colburn is our guest. He's the host of the podcast My Weekly Mixtape. Available wherever you listen to your podcasts, and you can go to myweeklymixtape.com for more and be on the lookout for a Van Halen episode to be airing soon.
Very excited about that one.
All right, let's get into some rock books that you've read that you want to talk about. One is called The Daily Adventures of Mixer Man, released in 2009. Tell us what or who this one is about.
This book is written by Mixer Man. He is a board op that has recorded a ton of albums, and it could be my favorite satire book based on the music industry. It is based around a true story. Regardless of your level of music knowledge, this book is kind of like the trials and tribulations, if you will, of a bidding war caliber band. And what that means is a lot of labels, if they found a band that was quote unquote catching fire on the live scene, labels would sometimes get into bidding wars to get their hands on the band, offering them more perks, more contracts, blah, blah, blah. Well, this band apparently had all the looks in the world, but zero talent. Then you throw them into a major label recording session with a infamous producer, famous and infamous, and what would appear to be an endless budget, meaning spare no expense. You basically get this recipe for one great story. And what I love about this book is this actually started as a blog back in the early 2000s. So the album recording sessions were happening in 2002. And what this guy would do is every night he would come home, no matter what time he got in, and he would just write about that day. And he would post it on a blog. And he got through about 3/4 of the recording process. And it went from like 200 people looking at the blog to 200,000 people. And people were posting it on music boards and arguing over the decisions made. So he had to keep everybody under wraps, including himself, thus the name Mixer Man.
Yeah.
And he was talking about people in the industry and kind of blowing things up from the inside out and exposing a lot of the stuff that happens. But at the same time, he was also talking about things that happen in the studio, signal processing, getting the proper sound on a kick drum, and how long that goes into getting the right drum sound for an album recording, and changing that drum sound, and using items like Pro Tools versus actual analog tape, this is around the time that the industry was making that big switch. So there is some inside baseball stuff, but the guy is such an amazing writer that he explains everything at a layman's level so that anybody can understand what's happening when he talks about signal flow.
Right.
But he knows how to paint the people in this band, and he basically makes them as characters. And the way he describes them is so vivid and so perfect that anybody who's ever been in a band or been around bands can relate to the stories he tells in this book. I laughed in this book probably more times than any book I've ever read, maybe because I enjoy the recording process and music so much, but I think anybody would enjoy this book.
Can we assume that this is somebody that we would recognize if he gave his real name?
I would guess so, but there has never been any confirmation over what this band was. There was ridiculous amounts of speculation back in 2002 of what band it could have been.
But also Mixer Man, like he's somebody well known. Like, could he be like Bob
he has
Rock?
other books, but I'm sure I'm sure it's something that could be discovered.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how hidden it is, but I kind of enjoy the facade around everything.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I want to dig into it because it's just so well written and so fun. You actually, at the end of the blog, he kind of cut it off right towards the end. And he said, all right, because at that point, everybody was like salivating to know what was happening the next day. Then he finished it for the book. As soon as it came out, I grabbed the copy and I was so happy to see how the story ended. And no spoilers.
A few other books you mentioned I want to ask about: the Underrated Rock Book from 2018 and the Underrated Rock Book 2, which was released a year ago, October 2022, both by author Jim Santora Jr. These look to be right down my alley here. Tell us about these books.
These are books. I've known Jim for a few years through my podcasting. He's been a guest on my shows several times. He's a great guy to talk music with, and he's also a great writer. And he did 2 books that are 200 overlooked albums that may have fallen off your radar. Now, as somebody on My Weekly Mixtape I talk to you about the balance. When we make a mixtape, it's specifically about a band. You want to have a balance of the hit songs and kind of the deeper cuts. And what Jim does in these books is takes it to the next level. So instead of just the songs that are the deep cuts on the album, he's kind of looking at this from two different lenses. One, a popular band that everybody knows and loves, but an album that maybe falls off the radar. So for an example, Motley Crue's 1994 self-titled album with John Corabi.
Yeah.
It falls off the radar because it's not Vince Neil. But make no mistake about it, it's probably one of, if not to some people, the best Motley Crue album ever.
I have heard that before. Hooligan's Holiday is on there, which is a great song.
Badass song. And then you mesh that in with artists like Badlands and Fastway, whose self-titled albums are not on everyone's radar, but should be. I mean, Fastway, you have Dave King from Flogging Molly in his early metal days. How amazing is that? And you hear the difference in his voice. Like, these are albums. I love going through this book and reading it. And as I read his passage, I will actually put the book down, pull up the album and kind of scroll through it, or pull my CD out, because it'll be like, oh my God, I completely forgot about these songs or this album. And it kind of unlocks a lot of cobwebs in our musical minds. And it's kind of a great book for discovery. So I highly recommend that one.
Second book mentions the Beau Brummels and their 1967 album Triangle, a folk psychedelic country rock band. No hits, but a sign of what future sounds were coming. And they made an appearance on the Flintstones as the Beau Brummel Stones. That's what you get in that book. Yeah.
It's just a lot of great stuff. And he tells some good anecdotes around the albums, and kind of highlights what songs you should be checking out. So it's a great way to kind of deep dive if you were into rock during the 80s and 90s, and there may have been some albums that you're kind of like going back and rediscovering. Some of them aren't even available on streaming services, so you really got to dig. And I like the fact that there's this spectrum of music that may have fallen off the radar.
Let's talk about some books on rock that you want to read but you haven't yet. Conversations with Tom Petty from 2005, updated and expanded in 2020 by author Paul Zollo. So why this specific book?
Tom Petty's probably my favorite artist of all time.
Really?
From a songwriter's perspective, when I write music, I'm always thinking, what would Tom Petty do? Like, I know I'm not trying to clone him, but when I'm writing music, I always have his mindset musically. Because his music, again, I told you at the beginning of the show, one of the first records I put out with my parents was that Chipmunk Punk, Refugee, one of the first rock songs I fell in love with. So when you start listening to his rock albums, when you play in rock bands, you kind of see what a Tom Petty rock song brings to the table. But then you go on to Wildflowers and you hear these gorgeous acoustic ballads like the title track. And then you kind of dive deeper and he does some darker, more introspective music. Then you get into the later years and you've got Mojo and you've got the blues rock side of the band. And you just bring this all together, and it's really everything kind of I love about music all wrapped up in one artist. So that's one that's definitely on my must-read list.
Yeah, here's a quote from Bob Dylan, who said, "The world doesn't need any more songs unless someone's going to come along with pure heart and has something to say. That's a different story." And Zollo follows in the book with, quote, "In the history of popular music, has there ever been anyone with a heart purer than Tom Petty?" And that's with his lyrics, too. A friend of mine, Kevin Brown, he hosts the Tom Petty Project podcast. And we've talked about how Tom Petty just lyrically, how he's able to say so much with so few words. He can just sum up, he could paint a picture or a thought. Just amazing.
You could feel it in his lyrics. And if you were to just speak them to somebody, you might be like, well, that doesn't sound really deep. But then when you hear it in song, it really takes it to another level. And it's something, that's why I think people truly love Tom Petty. That's why pretty much every country artist ever name drops Tom Petty, because it's a universally loved music. And anyone that truly, truly despises Tom Petty's music, I think is doing it to just out of spite. I can't see why it just relates to everybody. There's just such a beauty and innocence and kind of all encompassing. He brings all eras of rock into the Heartbreakers. And I just love the fact that there was kind of no avenue left unexplored in that band's discography. Minus dubstep, but I don't think we need that.
Yeah. The little trivia, who was Tom Petty's guitar teacher back in Florida? As a famous musician.
Ooh.
Let me give you.
Well, I don't know the answer, so it would be a pure guess.
Okay. I could give you initials.
All right.
DF.
Donald Fagen from
Close.
Steely Dan?
Donald
Okay.
is the right first name. Welcome to the Hotel California.
Really?
Don Felder.
Really? Wow.
Because Felder was living in Florida. And he said a young 14, 15-year-old Tom Petty was teaching him to play guitar. He said he was, he wasn't this outstanding guitarist, but he knew he had that ability to do something. He was something special there,
Wow, I love learning something new. I'm going to take that one with me now because
Yeah.
I didn't. Now I really want to read the book.
Yeah. Yeah, Don Felder. Who would have thought, right? I always thought
Yeah.
Felder was just like a West Coast guy the whole way, And sure enough,
Yeah, no, that's why I was trying to think. I didn't know when I was mentioned Steely Dan. I'm like, I don't think they're from Florida. This would be
Yeah.
a stretch, but
Yeah. Another on your to-read list, Dave Grohl's The Storyteller, Tales of Life and Music from 2021. New York Times bestseller. So, talk about this one. You're a big fan of Grohl.
I had an opportunity in 2007. I was sitting in an airport after a conference, sitting there in my suit after a 13-hour day with my tie hanging down, and Dave Grohl walks by. And I say to my boss, I'll be right back. I'm just got to take a minute. And he hangs up the phone, and I just walk over and I said, hey, Dave, I don't want to, just, dude, like, never mind. In Utero, Foo Fighters. Like, I'm a huge fan of your music. And he's like, thank you so much. He shook my hand and kind of gave me that bro hug. And then Taylor Hawkins walks up next to him.
Oh, man.
Now, this was the week prior to Echoes, Silence, Patience, and Grace came out. And Taylor Hawkins walks up and I'm like, Taylor Hawkins, I saw you drum for Alanis Morissette on the Jagged Little Pill tour. And no faster could those words come out of my mouth where Dave Grohl just smirks, elbows him in the ribs and goes, see? People know who you are. And I just said, look, gentlemen, I said, I'm a huge fan. I said, my wife it's one of the few bands my wife and I truly see eye to eye on. And I said, Dave, not for anything. If she was standing here with me right now, I might be leaving single. And he started laughing. He goes, I don't know how my wife would feel about that. But I said, if you'd be so kind to sign an autograph. And he did to my wife, him and Taylor Hawkins. We still have it framed to this day. Literally, this whole 90 seconds was maybe all we talked. And I just felt what a genuine person he was. And everything you hear on TV when he goes to see other bands and he brings other artists up on stage with the Foo Fighters, like Shania Twain this past week, or Rick Astley bringing him up on stage to do Never Gonna Give You Up. He has such a love for music. And you think about the things that he does with the bands he brings on tour with the Foo Fighters, trying to kind of bring bands like the Struts and kind of give them a name for themselves. And he just has a passion and a love for music that I think is infectious and something I'm very interested to hear more about.
Yeah, and it sounds like a great read. Another book you want to read, and I want to read, is coming out next month. James Hetfield of Metallica has written Messengers, the Guitars of James Hetfield. It's due out November 21st from Permuted Press. The promo for the book says, James Hetfield shares his personal collection of treasured guitars and reveals the story and significance of each within his life and career as the frontman, guitarist, and songwriter for Metallica. And it looks like some great shots of his guitars are throughout the book with stories behind each. What are you hoping to get from James in this book?
I'm really hoping for some nerdy inside Metallica baseball. If a certain guitar's tone is what caused the opening guitar on Sanitarium for that clean sound that he got at the opening guitar, or the opening of One, those kind of quieter moments, why he chose the guitars he chose on certain songs. If there were certain guitars that sounded better for the heavier, faster stuff, where there's like, I'm really hoping to get kind of stories about why those guitars provided the right sound that he was looking for or the band was looking for in the recordings. Metallica is one of my favorite bands of all time. I even love the stuff that they've put out, like Load, Reload. I know people are out there screaming right now. I actually like some of the songs on Saint Anger. I'm not a fan of how it was recorded. Neither am I a fan of how And Justice for All was recorded with the less bass from Jason Newsted, but I still love the songs. And I love Death Magnetic, even though it was brick wall to the point that it was almost nauseating to my ears to listen to.
Right.
Thank God people out there in Guitar Hero land remixed the album undistorted, because there's some great songs on there. I love Metallica, and I would love to hear kind of the really deep stories behind the songs, kind of like what I do on my show. Hopefully this book answers the questions I would ask him.
And let's wrap up with a book that you'd like to see written but hasn't yet, an autobiography by Trey Anastasio of Phish. Why this specific artist? And what are some of the things you'd like to see Trey write about in the book? I have one thing I would love to read from him. I'll wait for your answer.
Sure. My reasoning is because Phish is kind of a phenomenon. When you think about the Grateful Dead had their moment in the 70s and even into the 80s up until Jerry passed. And I feel like Phish were not handed that torch. They were just kind of lit on fire, because when Jerry passed, these Grateful Dead fans kind of needed something musically. And I feel like they did carry that torch, but there's so much about this band's music that I find fascinating. And Trey is such a unique songwriter. He has done symphonic pieces that he's written himself. He is a mastermind when it comes to songwriting. And yet, when you go into his solo albums like Shine, which was produced by Brendan O'Brien, he puts out these beautiful 3 and 4 minute pop rock songs that I'm shocked didn't make huge waves on the radio. And I get that people automatically tie Phish into the jam band scene. And, you know, oh my God, well, they play a solo for 45 minutes. How can that be interesting? They make it interesting. And kind of the stories behind the songs of how they get them from a place on the live stage to where they become their final studio pieces and are always evolving through the band, through the years and through their live performances. I would just love to hear stories about, and obviously he also had some issues in his personal life that I'd love to hear how he dove into, how he dealt with that, and how that helped him kind of musically on that path.
Well, I'd love to read about the band Oysterhead. You know the band.
Oh, God,
okay,
yeah.
Okay. Trey on guitar and vocals, Les Claypool of Primus on bass and vocals, Stuart Copeland of the Police.
Oh.
They released an album in 2001, The Grand Pecking Order. They toured to support it, but it didn't last long. And they reunited for a show in 2006, again in 2019. Trey was quoted as saying the three still talk about recording a second album.
I hope they do.
That
Les is one of the best bass players ever. He is on another planet.
Yeah.
Stuart Copeland is probably, and I know people that are fans of him are going to be like, how dare you say this, but one of the most underrated drummers ever, because people automatically think, well, the Police songs can't be that complicated.
Oh, no.
Go back and look at what he does and listen to what he does in those songs. They are so insanely complex. He is a complete genius behind the kit.
As much as I love Sting as a solo artist, he's never had a band behind him like Andy Summers and Stuart Copeland, those two guys. It's just, it's a sound that's so unique to those two guys. And Andy Summers just recently talked about, he and Andy were more than happy to continue with the Police, but Sting wanted to go on as a solo artist. And Andy Summers just like, look, I can't put a spin on it. That's all it is. He wanted out, and that was it.
And that's a shame, but I will say this, the 2007 tour, I did not go to it, but I personally wasn't a fan of a lot of the rearrangements. I really wish they would have played a lot of the songs a little more. I'm not saying just play the album, buddy. I'm not that kind of person, but I feel like they took a lot of liberties, and I feel like that might have hindered things moving forward, in my opinion, because they could have easily sold out stadiums for multiple nights if they went out and even remotely played the songs the way people were familiar with them. Does that make sense?
Yes. Could that have been, and I don't know, and Police fans, you could speak to this, but could it have been a situation like Robert Plant agreeing to work with Jimmy Page only if they rearrange the songs and do them differently, not exactly the same way? Maybe that's what it is. Maybe that's what like Sting said, look, I'll do this, but I'm not going out there and playing the songs note for note like they were in the studio.
And that's a shame because you realize how...
Could be wrong.
Yeah, but when the Police ended in the 80s, there was 20-something years of buildup to that 2007 tour. And a lot of people saw them for the first and only time on that tour. And I'm not saying to play every single song exactly like the album and just go out there and kind of just play the hits with backing tracks, so to speak, but kind of finding a happy medium where, you know, kind of explore the middle parts of the songs, but keep kind of some of the parts with familiarity to people.
Yeah. On the web, where can people find you? Where can they hear you? And also social media, plug away.
Sure thing. You can find it at myweeklymixtape.com. That's the site where I have all the back catalog of episodes. And you can also use that to contact me and reach out to anywhere on social media. On social media, Twitter, X, whatever we're calling it nowadays, Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, every social media haunt, TikTok, YouTube, wherever you go for social content, at My Weekly Mixtape. I run all of the social channels, so feel free to drop me a line, reach out. I love talking music with people. The reason I do this show is to have a conversation with music each week. I kind of refer to the show as my weekly therapy session because talking music with people makes me happy. It is my downtime. It is how I like to relax. Absolutely. And anybody that enjoys that back and forth conversation, I love to bring them in on the conversation. So tune in. If you like what you hear, please reach out to me. Please subscribe. I'm always looking to continue the conversation after we hit stop on the episode with people that might feel a little differently. Why did you choose this song over this one? Kind of have that conversation post episode.
Brian Colburn, thanks, man. This was great.
My pleasure, man. Thank you so much for having me. And I can't wait to hear what people think of our Van Halen episode coming up next month, because I have a feeling we're going to, it's going to be a little divisive. I don't know. I don't want to go in and say people are not going to like it, because I've shared the song list with people that I'm friends with personally. And a lot of them go, oh, love the choice with this and this, but how did you not include this? And it's like, yeah,
some of their biggest hits aren't on there. So yeah, it's not as easy as you think once you start getting into it. You got to pare it down to a certain number, and it's not that easy.
And it's all about, and the joke obviously for the dad puns is striking a balance between all the songs we're choosing, between the big hits and the deep cuts. And let's just be honest, Van Halen has more than 24 hit songs. And we had 3 of us, 8 songs each. So even if we picked all hits, we still wouldn't have gotten all the hits in.
Wouldn't have covered them all. So, all right, Brian, thanks, man.
My pleasure.
Well, that was an adventure.
That was quite a show you put on today.
Well, let me just close this conversation by saying you are one unique individual.